these things have a big impact. Now, one of the questions is, what about the behavior of permit holders? You know, because the concern is you let people carry permanent concealed handguns, they're going to have accidents, they're going to go and commit crimes themselves. And in fact, what you find is that permit holders tend to be extremely law-abiding. I don't know if you guys can read these things. But my book, the third edition, More Guns, Less Crime, that just came out this summer, goes through the data for 25 states and the text and footnotes. But I can just go through some of the stuff here. Let me mention Florida, for example. Between October 1st, 1987 and August 31st, 2010, Florida had issued permits to over 1.8 million people, about 1.84 million people. Many of those people have renewed them multiple times. On average, renewed them about 2.5 times. That means on average, the average permit holder had their permits for over 12 years. And of those people, 167 had had their permits revoked for any type of firearms-related violation. They don't go through it on the website, but I've called up the people who put together their statistics, and they tell me that that overwhelmingly tends to be people who accidentally carried a concealed handgun into a gun-free zone, like a school or airport or something. But that's 1/100th of 1 percentage point. Now, another way you can look at it is over the last 32 months, since January 2008, there have been 4 additional permit holders who have had their permits revoked for any firearms-related violation. They have over 750,000 active permit holders in Florida. That comes to an annual revocation rate of 0.0002%. I would argue it's pretty hard to find virtually any other population that has as low of any type of, and again, most of these are fairly trivial violations that are there. Problem. An example of somebody who carried a concealed handgun into an airport, which you guys may know about, is Barry Switzer. Some years ago when he used to be coach for the Dallas Cowboys, for any football fans in here, trivia, he was late for a team game, ran into the airport, forgot he had a concealed handgun on him, buzzers went off, he gets arrested, couldn't make it to the team plane. But, it's true the Cowboys were having a bad year. But I don't think anybody really viewed Barry Switzer as a real public safety threat that was there. He simply forgot that he had the handgun with him, and that's, when you're talking about millions of people with permits, that happens. Right now, my guess is, for the numbers, because I can't get it for all the states, and we can talk about that, because not all states require permits. But of the states that do require permits, and some states are counties, and I didn't call up all the 100 counties in some of these states to track down the numbers, but for the states where we are able to get numbers, it's basically about a little bit over 6.2 million Americans right now are legally licensed to carry permanent concealed handguns. That's a lot of people. And now if you look at Texas, in 2009, there was a little bit over 400,000 people with active licenses. Now, the last year the Department of Public Safety has detailed breakdowns for the behavior of permit holders was 2007. There were about 290,000 active permit holders then. 160 were convicted for either misdemeanors or felonies. Overall, overwhelmingly, these are misdemeanors. But overall, it's a rate of about 0.05%, so it's about 0.05 of 1 percentage point. That's about 1/7 the rate of convictions for the general population. But again, the general population is more likely to commit felonies than these permit holders were. And the most frequent type of revocation, 29 of these 160 cases involve carrying a weapon without a license. Just like when you drive, you got to have your driver's license with you. Sometimes people forget to have their wallet or their license with them, and they get into trouble. But that's by far the biggest category. The next largest category was 24 cases of domestic violence. None of those involved a weapon being used of any type, let alone a gun. But over the preceding 5 years, from 2002 to 2006, the average rate that they were convicted of misdemeanors or felonies was 0.04%. So we could go through that more, but I think it gives you a pretty good idea of the breakdown there. Now I know you guys are going to have some questions, so let me just kind of summarize here. and that is my research convinces me that police are the single most important factor for reducing crime. But I think one thing that police understand themselves is that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crime has been committed. And that raises the question about what do you recommend that somebody do when they're having to defend themselves against a criminal. And simply telling people to behave passively turns out to be pretty bad advice. Having a gun is consistently, according to the National Crime Victimization Survey by the Department of Justice, is consistently by far the safest course of action for people to take. You know, there's a statement that's often out there, and there's a kernel of truth to it, but I think it's very misleading. And that is, if you compare passive behavior to all forms of active resistance together, passive behavior is slightly safer, though it's not really statistically significantly different. But the problem is, and the reason why it's misleading, is that under the heading of active resistance, you're lumping together all sorts of different things. Some which are much safer than passive behavior, and some which are much more dangerous. So for example, it includes everything from yelling, running away, using your fist, using a baseball bat, mace, a knife, a stun gun, or a gun. For example, for women, by far the most dangerous course for a woman to take when she's confronted by a criminal is to use her fist. There's a very simple reason for that, and that is you're virtually always talking about a male doing the attack. And for a woman to go and use her fist, there's very likely to be a physical response back from the attacker, and given that, a high probability of either serious injury or death. The second most dangerous course of action, again much, much more dangerous than passive behavior, is to run away. If women succeed in running away, that's great. But unfortunately, women tend to be significantly slower runners than men, particularly for the age groups which are most likely to engage in the violent crime. Anyway, if you break down these different categories, you find, rather than lumping everything together, you find that using guns is by far the safest course of action. And as I mentioned before, the other group, so there's basically two groups. There's women, the elderly, people who are relatively weaker physically benefit the most from owning guns, and also the people who are most likely to be victims of guns, which basically, unfortunately, tend to be one very concentrated group in this country, and that's poor blacks who live in high-crime urban areas. So basically, it's the most vulnerable people in our society who benefit the most from having the option to be able to go and protect themselves. So I appreciate your time, and I'm happy to try to answer.
In light of today's events, could you expand upon some more examples of some of the crime victim events that were stopped by law-abiding citizens with their own violence?
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, there are lots of them. A lot of them never even get much news attention because many times they get stopped before they get, anybody gets killed. But, you can go through, since I was supposed to give the talk originally in the law school today, I'll give one example from a law school. At the Appalachian Law School, about 8 years ago, there was an attack in which 3 people were killed. I actually gave a talk there a few years ago. They invited me to come there. It was pretty interesting to go and talk to the people who had been present at the attack. But what happened was 2 students there at the school who were outside when the attack started to occur. One of them, a former deputy sheriff from North Carolina, a different state. Both of them had concealed carry permits in Virginia since they were living there at the time. Ran to their cars, got their handguns, came back, pointed their guns at the attacker. A third student tackled him, and the 3 of them held him on the ground for 11 and a half minutes before the police arrived. Again, I could go through the news media coverage on that. It's actually kind of interesting because if you do a Nexus search on that, in the 1 week after that attack, you'll find 218 separate news stories. Only 3 news stories actually mention that the students used their guns to stop the attack. Typically, you'd see discussions about students tackled the attacker, or subdued the attacker, or pounced on the attacker, or that they held him until the police arrived, all of them which were true, though I would go and argue it's fairly misleading and actually dangerous because they somehow gave the impression that running across an open field in order to go and attack somebody who's armed is likely to be successful. And the